a quick overview, and then 5 minutes or so in, I'll get into more technical information. So those of you that are in the line, you probably won't miss too much. Thank you all for being here. We appreciate it. This is really important, as most of you guys know, to what we do every day, to our clients. I brought a sign-in sheet, so please sign this, pass it around. We're going to, like I mentioned, do an overview presentation here for the next 20 or so minutes, and then we'll be joined by City of Austin Watershed staff. So I'll be giving most of the presentation, but Greg and Jeff at certain points may chime in. They've been instrumental in this 2.5-year process of amending this ordinance. So with that, I'm going to dive in. As I mentioned, this started 2.5 years ago. This arrived out of a city council resolution that asked for a pretty comprehensive look at and revisions to our ordinance. And the key themes that they looked for and assigned staff with tackling was the importance of protecting the riparian areas and floodplains. Oh, that's just looking good. Looking at best practices throughout the nation, but lessons learned in Austin and elsewhere. They're having a significant number of issues with maintenance and erosion issues, so took the notion that prevention is affordable, but repairs and maintenance is not. They wanted the staff to look at simplifying the ordinance. It's complex, we know that. I would argue that it's still a little complex, but they have made some efforts to simplify. You'll see those. And then looking at, we approved Imagine Austin, our comprehensive plan, and so looking at sustainability and the future growth of Austin, and balancing, this was key certainly to our industry, environmental protection with the development opportunity. So staff had that task at hand saying, you can't just go take all the development rights away and screw these guys. So I feel like we did get some balance in this ordinance, which you'll see. This is just a general overview map, which you all should be very familiar with, our watersheds. But what you'll see in this ordinance revision is that primarily the most significant changes are impacting the suburban watershed, which is the largest watershed area we have, regulation area, and encompasses most of the future growth that we'll see. So this is a map that depicts that. I think tells a pretty interesting story, but the suburban watersheds have 78% of our undeveloped land. So you can see why it's so important to look at this. As we know, growth is coming to Austin, and much of it will take place in our suburban watersheds. And as you guys probably see with your clients and projects you're working on now, we're doing more and more in the eastern part of Austin and suburban watersheds. Furthermore, most of our floodplains are in the suburban watersheds. Nearly 1 in 6 suburban acres reside in a 100-year floodplain. So another interesting fact, but you'll see significant impacts because of that. And then we also, you're probably aware, that's more the highly erodible soil. So you see, like I mentioned, the maintenance issues, older subdivisions where they've gone in and channelized the floodplain. They're seeing, houses falling in, backyards, fences, some really nasty stuff taking place. So they've had a slew of maintenance issues, and they're looking to help prevent that as we go forward. So these were the 7 key themes and areas that Council said you need to tackle with this ordinance rewrite. Creek protection, floodplain protection, development patterns and greenways, improved stormwater controls, mitigation options. They wanted the simplification of regulations and the maintenance of development opportunity, and coordination with regional partners, so Travis County, other organizations that we interact with. So those were the key themes when this kicked off 2.5 years ago. And first and foremost, and this is one that probably affects what we do pretty significantly day to day, when you're looking at developable area on a piece of property, but related to creek protection, they have now extended the drainage threshold, which was previously let's see, previously started at 320 acres for a minor waterway in the suburban watersheds. They've now extended what was previously citywide on our more restrictive drinking water protection zone watershed, 64-acre drainage threshold. So pretty significant. This is going to extend your buffers up into the headwaters and put more setbacks, generally speaking, on your property. So this was a significant policy shift, a significant difference than how we'd operated for many, many years, since I think 1986, the Comprehensive Watershed Ordinance. So where previously a minor waterway would be triggered with a 320 to 640 acre drainage threshold, it's now 64-acre drainage threshold. Previously, the intermediate watershed, intermediate waterway was a drainage threshold of 640 to 1,280 acres, and it's now 320. And then for your major waterway, it's now 640 acres, used to be greater than 1,280. So you can see pretty significant shift. With that, what they did to somewhat counter that, I think, and in many cases you'll see on projects, it does help, but they moved away from net site area. Now this is just in suburban watersheds, so if you're still in the drinking water protection zone, still need to do your net site area calcs, but in the suburban watershed now, you no longer need to do net site area deductions. So you're not taking out your critical water quality zones. The other piece that's significant is they removed the water quality transition zone. Again, just in the suburban watersheds, but you no longer have a critical zone with an additional water quality transition zone off of it. So in some cases you gain a little, depending on your drainage areas. Some cases you may not. They also established set buffer widths. Previously, you probably recall a minor buffer would be 50 to 100 feet, intermediate would be 1 to 200, and a major could be 2 to 400. They're now set across the board, 100 foot for minor, 200 feet for intermediate, 300 feet for major, and that's on each side of the creek center line. So that's another shift there. The other thing that they did that I think, especially on larger projects, may help and give our clients some flexibility is they now allow buffer averaging. So determine your buffers, determine that area within your buffer, and if you have some unique site constraints or development issues or maybe a critical environmental feature or something that would warrant the need to maybe squeeze in one area, extend further up a stream that may not be classified, as long as your total area within your buffer remains the same, you can vary those widths a little bit. So they're calling it buffer averaging. We did it, I think they referenced throughout the process our Whisper Valley project as being one that really was kind of a flagship for doing buffer averaging. And so it's something we've done here in our office and is now permitted by code. So pretty significant shifts there. Does anybody have any questions on that? And I would say, like Greg mentioned, they've looked at it for a client. I think, generally speaking, it's somewhat of a wash. But on smaller sites that may not have even had a buffer previously, could really be impacted. So in some cases you may be better off. In some cases it's a wash, and in some cases you could be in really bad shape. So it's important that we're looking at this kind of early and upfront for clients when they come to us with a tract over there. Do you have anything to add? Yes.
Slopes that they don't mention in the net site, that's not taken out.
Correct. You do not have to deduct for slopes anymore.
And it's based on gross site area. Yeah.
Q1, Q2 tables.
No more Q1, Q2 in suburban watersheds. And you get your full gross site area. So that's the other argument is you may have some more extended buffer areas, but if you've got 80% impervious cover, you've got 80%, you can throw that all on your developable area. So it may look like you're developing it, oh my gosh, that thing's at 100% or whatever, when, you're not really with the buffers, but.
And keep in mind, you're talking about the desired development zone. So you're looking at areas that are generally, a lot less slope.
Flatter.
Or the slopes are in the creek.
Right.
And your slopes are down in the creek areas, which, you know, are the areas you want to protect anyway.
Exactly. And net side area does remain in play, like I said, in the drinking water protection zones. You're still gonna do Q1, Q2, and all those tables there.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting concepts that have come about this whole discussion over the last 2 years. And yeah, initially when this started, in the very beginning with guys like Pat Murphy and Mayor Leffingwell now, the idea was, well, let's try to do a better job further up the creek. Let's be smarter about what we're doing. Let's, in the lower portions of the watershed where we've got these extremely wide critical transition zones on top of each other, why not pull that back and be a little more realistic about the area we're trying to protect? But let's go further up and do more in the upper regions of the watershed to control those areas, try to minimize erosion. So the idea that started with was that premises, that we wanted to be smarter and more effective, more efficient in the approach out here. So I think in general, this whole process stayed very close to that concept. Obviously it got a little further off in some places than others, but aside from the Whisper Valley project that you mentioned, which I think really benefited from that similar type of approach, Jonathan McKee and I worked on another project for Matt Harris on the Butler Tract, and we found in comparing the two different watershed versions that he's actually better off under the new rules, both from a growth site area and from a setback standpoint around the creek. So the concepts in general are working fairly well. I think if you're, as a general rule, if you're in the lower regions of a drainage basin, you're going to see some improvement. If you're in the very upper region of the watershed, the very top end of it, you're going to see more impact than you did before. However, you still get the benefit of that growth site area opportunity, which is going to help in a lot of cases. So.
Perfect. And then this map, I think, just does, excuse me, a good job depicting those now protected creeks. So the headwater creeks are shown in red here. So pretty significant impact of additional headwaters that we're now protecting.
Melissa,
Yes.
is there any change in the variance process if you are newly?
They've added some additional administrative variance options, which I'll run through for you, but no. Well, and the other thing I would say to that, which is coming up on the next slide, is they have also added a number of, they've expanded what you can do in the critical water quality zone. And there's still the ability to do crossings and streets and drive, all of those things. So, yes.
What about for the buffer averaging? Is that, I assume that needs to go back through Watershed, that can't be approved by PDR directly? You've got to coordinate with Watershed on the approval for that?
My understanding is they're coordinating together on that. So your reviewer would be working with Watershed to go through that process.
But it's solely administrative, and
Yes.
then is there any, it used to be when we platted a property, we had to show all that on the subdivision plat. What if you show it on the subdivision plat, then at the time of site plan you want to edit those limits with buffer averaging based on what your site plan wants to do? Has there been any discussion about how those can be modified once they're platted, and if a replat would then be required, or what the effect of that would be?
There's a lot of those things that we really
Okay.
haven't jumped into yet,
Okay.
or staff.
And-
Very good point. One of several like that is, so if you have it sort of is steering your development in a little different direction, in that you're probably going to want to have a little different conversation with your clients about, let's not go out and just plat this blindly. Let's think about what we're going to plat it in anticipation of, and design a subdivision around that. So again, we'll have to rethink our approach and guide our clients differently for these types of issues.
And this would be a good question to ask Matt when they're here. Not that he'll be able to answer. I've already posed some kind of grandfathering, if you will, type questions to him, which he's had to punt to legal, which is going, they've gone to lens size, and then we're still going round and round. But good questions to pose to them, because of course, when they're writing an ordinance, they're not thinking of every potential development review issue. But another solution could potentially be subdivide it, show the buffers on the subdivision with a note that per section 25.8, whatever, that allows buffer averaging,
They may be modified.
they may be modified at site plan. Now, we'd have to confirm that with staff, but it's still, I think there's ways around it, but we have to be aware and cognizant of it, so yeah, you don't get stuck. Because otherwise, I think the plat, you'd have to go back and amend. If you put the buffer, if you put the set buffer and you didn't cite kind of that flexibility, you would have to go back and amend it, which
Well,
is.
I would guess that even if you did cite that flexibility, they're gonna ask you to amend that plat
I
because it's a
think-
recorded document. So
I would
unless
agree
there's
with
a way to
Yeah, I
discuss
don't
with
know.
staff
I
the
think it's-
option to defer it, like we defer some other things to the site plan process and not put it on the plat, which may be something we wanna bring up
I
as
think
an option.
what you'll see more of, probably Megan, in that regard, is I think you'll see on larger tracts especially, a more focus on the preliminary plan. And before you jump into final, make sure you're looking at your next site options as you're platting each piece of that preliminary plan so you can better define that. I think the reality is subdivision law is going to be separate from these watershed regs, and if it's there, whether it says you have the flexibility to move it, somebody's going to consider that as there until you get modified plat.
Sure.
So that's
Good
what I would
things to
do.
think about.
Yeah.
This is just, we're running out of time, so I'm gonna move quickly, but just a visual example of what Greg said, you know, where under this new, this is the new approved system, you actually kind of shrink down. This is the old system with the critical water quality zone in the middle, water quality transition zone on the outside. So you extend the headwater buffers up, but you actually shrink the buffers along the other waterways. This is the chart you have in front of you. I won't go into great detail. This is the same chart many of you probably have been using for years. It's a cheat sheet Watershed has available on their website, but they've updated it to reflect the new ordinance requirements. It's just a handy tool to have as you're going through the process. Another new element or piece of the ordinance is recognition of this erosion hazard zone, which is basically you need to stay out of zone altogether. It's going to be your highly erodible area. There's a definition of it here in the ordinance. Future stream channel where erosion is predicted to result in damage, loss of property, buildings, infrastructure, utilities, or other valued resources. So this is really the zone they're saying stay out of at all costs. Critical water quality zone, you can still go in and do some different things, but erosion hazard zone is the steer clear zone. And this is where, Chris, I was touching on kind of the different things and the expanded elements of things you can do in the critical zone. And that's open space, which, as you guys know, the city has kind of new open space, new, I say, a couple years old, open space requirements. Open space does not include parking lots. That seems obvious, but they made clear to state that. Multi-use trails, which is a new allowance. I think there was probably some allowance for it before, but it's stated now, and it's stated that they have to be out of a certain distance from the creek center line, depending on your waterway type, minor, major, intermediate. But they are now allowed in the critical zone, as well as urban agriculture and community gardens. Athletic fields, still you've got the provisions to allow for utility lines, parallel crossing, driveways. Driveways, although only, I believe, if you are within a center on Imagine Austin, which is a unique and new change. So you need to know that Imagine Austin plan and know where your site lies within that. There's different centers in that plan. But the other thing is detention and water quality and detention and green water quality controls are permitted in the critical. And then we'll get into floodplain modification in a minute, because that's a whole new kind of process if you're looking to do any floodplain modification. So they extended that. And here's kind of a profile of what they said, could look like when you've got your rain gardens, your trails, your filter strips. I mean, I doubt you're going to have all of that in your critical, but perfect world, you could do that. The other big key piece that council asked for them to consider was the expanded floodplain protection. Like I said, all of these channelized, or they cited a number of channelized floodplains where they've seen a lot of erosion and negative impacts from them. So the new kind of presumption is don't touch, stay out of. We don't want you modifying floodplains, so there's now a functional assessment, which is a new requirement in the environmental criteria manual, that really, you have to go through a pretty arduous process now to modify the floodplain.
And
So
it's,
that's,
it's very subjective
Yeah.
in the areas that you have to consider for replacement are based on multiples, and it can be anywhere from, well, it was up to 16 to 1.
they did drop that.
We got that reduced down to, what is it?
8 to 1. They
8.
cut them in half.
Cut them, yeah. But just be aware that when you modify floodplains, there's a big requirement. It's also very subjective, if you will. If they try to formalize what they've done in the past in the way of evaluating the area impacted and the amount of mitigation area that is involved with that impact. But we did a site visit with several guys from the Watershed Protection Group and looked at a few specific sites, and I will tell you, it is going to be a process that we're all going to have to get familiar with. I mean, it's admittedly it's both city and us, and they're going to be learning what each of those mitigation areas look like, what's good, what's poor, what's fair. There's all this rating system and mitigations based on multiples of the area impact.
Is this all floodplains or just?
Any floodplain you impact.
Any floodplain. You know, if you're doing anything within the critical that's permitted, that doesn't trigger it, but any floodplain modifications. And so, like Greg mentioned, they have a consideration in this new assessment for poor, fair, good, or excellent. And then there's all this criteria, but really, if you're not poor or fair and outside the critical water quality zone of the floodplain, requires a land use commission variance, and you still have to go through this entire functional assessment process, coordinating with staff, and you're trying to prove up that, you know, there's no significant environmental impact, and it's really, like Greg said, subjective, and we have a lot of concern with this. And this, the other piece that's a little tough going through the process is they were writing this into the ordinance, and then they gave us the rules, and the rules are what really drive and tell you what this functional assessment is and how you would arrive at getting an approval for floodplain modification. This came at the very tail end, a couple weeks before the ordinance was approved, and so they adopted these emergency rules. So this is in place, this functional assessment and all the criteria. A few of you, Megan, Wayne, Jeff, looked at, I don't know, I might have made that up, but a handful of you looked at this information and tried to provide feedback. They're in place for 6 months, but the final rules we're going through a stakeholder process on now. The final rules are proposed at this time, exactly the same as the emergency rules, but we still have an opportunity to work with staff to try to get these maybe in a better place. They did move with us a little by cutting these rates in half. I mean, they have helped us a little, but this is another big one to be aware of. And one of the questions we also posed was, you know, many times when we're doing this early due diligence phase, we need to know these sort of things. If we need to modify a floodplain, we need to know the condition of health. And at least initially what they told us is, you know, I mean, there's still a lot of that needs to be worked out. So just beware, really.
But keep in mind, it doesn't affect things that are normally allowed, like roadway crossings. You're not going to have to mitigate that if it's a permitted use.
Sure.
In the floodplain or in the 100-year.
Yeah, all those things I just rattled off.
So anything, basically where you're getting into this, just as sort of
Public roadway crossing, but a private roadway crossing.
well, private roadway, or if you just want to go out and you want to modify a channel and you're trying to pull floodplain in on one side, expand it over in another area, you might be able to do that, but you're going to go through a process of addressing all the mitigation that goes with it.
Right.
So that's just something, as Melissa said, that we need to advise our clients on, early on in the process to, you know, so they can anticipate that.
These are just a few things when they were looking at development patterns and greenways. They doubled the number of tier 2 options for PUD, planned unit development superiority. There were previously 10 environmental items that could get you superiority. They took that to 21. So that's a positive in the sense of gives us a little more options to work with when we're trying to negotiate a PUD for our clients or help our attorney friends do so. They did improve the existing transfer of development rights section to allow for increased flexibility. One thing that, and I don't have experience in doing it, and I don't think the city has had much, there's always been a transfer of development right opportunity, but it was previously only permitted through 2 different subdivisions, and it sounded very complicated, and they really did not get many folks using that and taking advantage of it. So the intent with kind of expanding it here was to make it a little easier on folks. They now allow you to do it between site plans or on a single site plan, transfer of development intensity, so there's a whole new expanded section on that that may be feasible and helpful for our clients in certain situations. I mentioned the allowing community gardens and trails within the critical water quality zone, athletic fields, I cited that. Although prohibiting new athletic fields in the critical water quality zone and the drinking water protection zone watersheds. This is another, this allowing less than up to 5,000 square feet of roadway projects without on-site water quality controls and impervious cover limits. So if you've got a minor, and this really, although from what I understand, benefits the city more than it does us. So adding bike lanes, or if you needed to expand a turn lane, you wouldn't have to provide water quality for it anymore. So that was a minor change. They also established limits for diversions of stormwater between watersheds to protect natural drainage patterns and topography. This is another significant shift just to be aware of as you're looking at water quality controls. Most of the projects we're looking at are going to be over the previous threshold, which was 20%. Impervious cover of the net site area used to be the trigger to provide on-site water quality controls. They've now moved away from a percentage requirement, and it's now a flat 8,000 square feet. So significant shift, but I think, like I said, in most cases, our clients aren't doing projects that are less than. But they cited that the reason they moved to this square foot example, what they cited is that somebody would have a 50-acre property, and they would go in at 19.5% impervious cover and not do any controls. Now, I can't imagine that's the typical, but they said that was happening from time to time, and they wanted to get away from that. So we're now at 8,000 square feet being the trigger. They've also added an allowance for the potential to stack your water quality and detention controls. I believe that's new. There's now a requirement for all water quality controls to be accessible for maintenance and inspections. I think that was required before, but the key is number 4, that they're now requiring a maintenance and inspection plan by a registered engineer with annual reporting for subsurface water quality ponds. And that's due to, you guys are aware of all the maintenance issues, and my understanding is they're trying to get away from subsurface ponds in general.
Do you know if item 3 applies to private? Previously, the maintenance for access and maintenance for inspections was only required for public.
I don't think it
shared,
applies to anything
private.
previous
So
or
it's,
permanent
I don't think so.
previously. It's just any
no, I just
new,
mean moving forward on private ponds.
New private ponds.
Yes, it does.
I believe so. That's a good question to ask him, but I'm
That
pretty
would
sure.
be a substantial change to the plans that we do on a normal basis. Right
new
now,
private ponds, yes, you need to anticipate
Yeah, but-
that'll be required.
Yes.
So that is a change. I just want to make sure it was clear
Yeah.
because that's
Yes.
a big impact.
It is. And then one of the goals was to remove code barriers related to incentivizing green stormwater infrastructure. They've done some of that, but you'll see phase 2 is about to kick off, which is going to focus more on kind of the green stormwater innovative control type elements. They've added some different mitigation options. We talked about the floodplain modification. There's some new redevelopment options in water supply, watersheds. And in general, they also modified the redevelopment exceptions throughout the ordinance, where previously you had pretty generic, straightforward section on redevelopment exceptions and then redevelopment in the Barton Springs zone. They've now expanded it, so there's a redevelopment section for suburban watersheds, water supply rural watersheds, Barton Springs zone, but they've actually expanded it. And I think in most cases will help us. But the one thing that's different previously applied to if you had development on your property. It was pretty generic kind of clause. City legal didn't like that, and they thought that we were encouraging, maybe development that wasn't compliant at the time it was developed. So they put in a new clause that you're allowed to reap the benefits of the redevelopment exception if there is no unpermitted development that has occurred on the site after January 1st, 1992. We fought them back and forth on that date. Originally, they had pulled it back even further, but our argument was you can't even get permits from, most of these cases, think Oak Hill or some of these areas that were in the county. How could you even prove back to the 80s that it was compliant then? And so we landed on 1992 based on the city feeling like there's permit information available and there's aerial kind of GIS information available to be able to look back to 92 and say, okay, that existed, you got it, you get to keep it, maintain it, and you only have to provide controls for the newly redeveloped area. But that is a shift as well. Talking about simplifying regulations, that's kind of interspersed throughout. Another big one that I think is important in many cases, they eliminated the boundary street deduction requirements. So that's something important to note. There's a number of kind of clarifications throughout the ordinance. They also, just for your purposes, they renamed what used to be the environmental assessment to the environmental resource inventory. The requirements for that haven't changed, but I guess there were issues differentiating between phase 1 assessments, and thank you, and the requirements related to a phase 1 ESA and the city EA. So it's just been renamed. And then this is an important one. I have some questions for Matt when they arrive, hoping they do, although he confirmed earlier. The coordination with regional partners. They've been coordinating. Travis County was at all of our stakeholder meetings, but interestingly, the Commissioners Court hasn't approved Title 30. So as most of you know, or you should know, that the development ETJ, now we're talking subdivisions in the ETJ are regulated by Title 30. Rather than Chapter 25 of the Land Development Code, there's a joint code between Travis County and the City of Austin. Same regulations, pretty much duplicates, but they have joint authority and joint review over subdivisions in the ETJ. So at this point, this ordinance is not in place relative to subdivisions in the ETJ. I anticipate, and I don't have that date from Matt, I want to ask him the question when they think they'll be through Travis County Commissioners Court, so we know. I anticipate that'll be fairly soon. But as I understand it, you're still required to meet the regulations if you're doing a site plan in the ETJ, because it does apply to site plans. It's just a subdivision piece that's not approved. That's my understanding. I need to clarify that with him. As I mentioned, there's a whole new kind of second phase of this going on, moving forward. And these have all, this is kicked off. We've had one meeting on it, and it will progress from there. But all of these elements are included in what they're calling Phase 2 of the Watershed Ordinance rewrite. And then there's also a Phase 3 that they're estimating and planning will align with the overall Land Development Code rewrite, which is also underway. Not to complicate things further, but there were significant recommendations in Imagine Austin to allow for development bonuses, incentives, different things in these major growth areas that were identified, kind of growth centers. So the idea is that there would probably be some flexibility and some leniency put in place if you fall within one of these growth areas. But that's slated to come as part of the Land Development Code revision. So, with that, I can attempt to answer some questions till they get here. I should check quickly to see if they sent a note. No note. So that's...
Do you have the section of the Watershed Ordinance that has that talks about the maintenance of the controls and the...
I do. Somewhere in this, I have the ordinance.
Well,
I
know,
can't
but just
cite it to
on
you.
that slide, did you have it? I didn't know if you referenced it.
I don't think it's referenced on the actual slide. But I can pull it for you.
I was just looking for it.
Yeah. One other mention that we did get a clarification on, I think is important, on one of Stephanie's projects was, there they are, was related to, she had a zoning ordinance, or a piece of property, there was a zoning ordinance with a conditional overlay on it, and it was pre, good afternoon. I'll finish my thought and then I'll do the intro if you don't mind. It was applied to a site in the suburban watershed that previously would not have had a buffer on it. But as part of the zoning conditional overlay, they required a buffer be put in place. So Stephanie raised the question, well, wait, do I comply with this conditional overlay? Or would I comply with the new ordinance? And so we raised the question of staff and it came back that you would need to comply with the new ordinance because a zoning ordinance does not grandfather you, it does not qualify you as a project, if you will. So the more restrictive regulation would apply, and in that case, the new watershed requirements would apply. So you probably have to explain that to your reviewer. There would certainly be, I think, questions that would potentially arise from that because it's very clearly a conditional overlay on the property. But that was an interpretation I thought was useful and could be something that you guys encounter. We're getting a lot of these type questions. So, McKee, did you have your hand up?
I did. This will probably be a question for that.
Well, let's introduce them while you're eating.
People, yes.
But we appreciate you guys being here. Matt Holland, Aaron, Pamela. I was going to say Pamela. I know Pamela. Got it. From Watershed, who we've been working with for 2.5 years.
Yeah.
2 years.
2 years, exactly.
We're excited to have them here, and so Greg and I just did a pretty good overview for them. And of course, you guys were here a few months ago, so.
Yes, just one more.
I
Give
know,
us presentation
another
sometime.
presentation. Oh, you can probably do it in your sleep.
I do this in your sleep, right?
Yeah.
Yes, wake up middle of the night, it's
Waking night.
balancing stuff.
Yeah, but I think what we decided on was just kind of an open discussion with you
Sure.
guys and Q&A and hopefully just kind of get the discussion going. And I'll let you kick off, McKee, if you want to, and we'll just go from there. And y'all please, grab some food and.
So, this is kind of a project-specific question, but site that's in the ETJ today, we actually did submit plating permits prior to the adoption of Watershed. So I guess my question pertains more to ensure that once this project does get from the site planning phase, it will be probably brought into full purpose limits. I
Okay.
don't know if there's any differences or potential hiccups for that process as it relates to the grandfathering and adoption rules. So, especially with the light that you just brought up of, today Travis County hasn't adopted any of the Title 30 stuff. So.
Well, that was one of the questions I had for you. When do you anticipate from a subdivision standpoint, the subdivision ETJ,
Yeah, great question.
when we're going to Commissioner's Court?
We've been talking with the county staff, and they're trying to get on the Commissioner's Court agenda sometime they're doing the planning in December, and they're hoping to go early in January.
Soon.
So probably early to mid-January is when we expect to go to the Commissioner's Court, and that would kind of finalize the Title 30 piece. Notably, the buffers I guess that doesn't count. So everything's kind of still frozen in the time for the Title 30 for subdivisions.
Right.
So site plans already have the watershed protection ordinance, that's, up and running. But then the subdivision stuff won't actually happen until the Commissioner's Court signs off on it.
Okay.
So as far as ETJ versus city limits, the ordinance doesn't make many changes on that. We actually we didn't touch impervious cover very much in this ordinance. There were a few changes actually in like fire lanes that are pervious, don't count toward impervious cover, and some other useful things that we think were improvements. But by and large, we didn't say things like, okay, the commercial limit is now this other thing, or and so forth. So we did clarify that mixed use is this blend of things, and it's actually pretty straightforward. I can go into that if you guys really want to hear about that. But as far as like something coming into the city limits, then you'd suddenly have a new higher impervious cover limit probably for that project. But I don't think the ordinance really touched anything that would shift your project into a different spot. We did get some questions about, you know, what happens with my old plat that has a water quality transition zone on it? Now that's gone, but now there's this new buffer, and how does that work? And I don't know that we actually have an answer to that yet. Aaron, were they still working out
The
that one?
answer is the 245 committee is actively working on that.
Right.
I have a feeling they'll be acting on, or
Yeah.
looking into a few things.
Actually, on that one, are you stating that if we do have a plat that shows old critical water quality and then water quality transition, we have to go through a separate, we're not having to do a grandfathering, I mean, we wouldn't want to grandfather if we wanted to modify those, we have that option, or?
Yeah, if you want to just comply with the new current code, it would mean you resubmit it, you'd replat it or
We
whatever.
would have to
Right. And-
So yeah, they're trying to see if there's,
Sarah?
the easy alternative would be to vacate and replat, but they're trying to see if there's a way to do it with the existing plat. There's a case pending where it was going to be difficult for them to go to the other owners that had the lots.
No, that's the tricky
Our plat.
plats.
Mhm.
If you've got multiple owners or something along those lines.
Right, and so there's this whole state requires honoring of plat notes and this and that and the other. There's some stuff I wasn't very familiar with, so I can't really comment on it, but they were saying, if you want to get in the weeds and try to figure out how to grandfather it or whatever, you would be going through the 245 committee. So,
Matt, a question came up a minute ago, earlier, about our impervious coverage based on gross side area, so you don't do the net side, those correct area calculations. In terms of construction on slopes above 15% in the suburban watersheds, is that still active construction on slopes?
well, there's some limits on, you know, driveways here versus
Right.
there, and that stuff's still in place, but you don't have to net
You're not
that
gonna
out.
net that out in your impervious coverage,
Right.
but you still have to watch
Right,
in terms of how much you have on certain construction,
right.
the amount of construction you have on certain slopes.
That's
So,
correct.
in effect, you still might be creating a slope map, if you will. Otherwise, how are you gonna do
Right,
that?
Yeah.
you still have to do the slope map to figure out if you have limitations.
And there's a lot of things like that that I just don't think, even in the courses of all the effort that went in over the last 2 years of going through this and trying to anticipate all the different things that would come about, there's gonna be a huge amount of different examples like that. We're gonna run into this,
It's gonna be probably at least
next
a
year
year
two,
or more
until
before we
we really
yeah.
crawl through more examples, different projects, and see how many different things are really impacted.
I'm just kind of thinking out loud here, but, I mean, the gross side area on a lot of sites is gonna kick up your impervious cover.
Right.
So those slopes aren't gonna limit it, you know, so yeah, you're limited on that spot with the steep slope, but to the extent that you get more impervious cover, there are certain things like buildings that don't have to do that, right? And so you actually could, you probably could get more impervious cover on your site with the building being able to be on top of that, some of that stuff and so forth, so.
I think it's only in your steeper slopes that becomes an issue.
Right. And suburban area,
Suburban, you're
there
not
are some
likely-
steep slopes there, but they're not nearly as
It's not like they
severe
encounter great deal.
as there are in the west. And that was one of the reasons we felt more comfortable with the growth side areas, and we really didn't think it was gonna have to, you know, get into some of that nitty gritty, but.
So we'll be actively working with PDRD this year, updating the environmental criteria manual and application packets to clarify things like, you know, the Q1, Q2 tables will need to change. But, you know, making sure that people know that the slow map still needs to be submitted.
Good idea.
Those are open.
It's not redundant, so you make that all clear.
When do y'all anticipate having those ready, just so that we know how to communicate when we submit applications with a checklist that are getting potentially kicked out, not having some of that?
We're hoping to have at least the first round of that stuff ready for the Q3 cycle. So that would be, that goes into our internal process on February 1st, but it's about a 6-month process, I guess.
Have y'all seen
there a way-
issues with application submittals and completeness checklists yet? Considering that, you know, we get kicked out all the time for not having a Q1, Q2 table if it's something like this, you know, that's a requirement.
I'm wondering, is there a way to have a draft something?
Yeah, I mean, as we start drafting things, we can have the draft criteria available for PDRD.
Yeah, I'm just trying to eliminate the added work on everybody in this room that may
It's gonna
come
be
up from that.
It's gonna be really confusing.
And we've been actively meeting with DAC and ED review and drainage review doing trainings on the ordinance.
There were questions related to the maintenance and the water quality pond maintenance. You want to ask those questions?
Yeah,
Megan, or-
the question I had was related to the new access requirements for water quality ponds and whether that applies now to all privately maintained, single ownership water quality facilities. And is that just in suburban, is that all through the city?
It's all through the city, and it doesn't mean you have to have a perimeter road and all that kind of stuff. It just means you have to show us that
How
there
you
is
plan
some way
access.
that you can get somebody in there
And that's-
reasonably.
That's for a subsurface system.
Well, it's actually for any.
Any
there's
sort of water
there's-
quality.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's another topic we can talk about in a second. But we were getting some ones that were like, oh, we're gonna use a crane to get it in there, or we're gonna use, or it's off the side of a cliff, or, you know, and it was like,
So what's considered
So-
reasonable, or is that up to us to determine?
I think you've worked-
I mean, I understand what we can do, I just know that, does PDR, are they the one to enforce that? If I say the client's planning to put a gate along a vertical wall pond and take a ladder down in there and it's only a 5-foot deep pond, are they gonna tell me, well, that's not acceptable, you need equipment, and I've got a maintenance company tell me I don't? Whose determination is it to say that it's reasonable or not?
so,
I mean, I think we'll be working with PDRD and our own field operations, to work on some criteria of showing, you know, examples of what we think would be reasonable. You could always, I think, you know, the ones that Matt's talking about in the past that we've seen, we had the owner, you know, telling us they've gone out to different maintenance companies and they can't get anyone to agree to come and work on the pond because it's just, you know, on the side of a
Take
ravine.
it in.
So if, I mean, if you had a maintenance company that could show, you know, yes, we are through this design, we feel confident that we could get in and meet the, you know, UCM maintenance requirements on this.
Okay, but we should expect to maybe need to provide that additional backup and coordinate until those guidelines are in place?
that is correct.
Okay.
And we'll, and I'm feverishly taking notes, so we'll be getting with Andy Linsizen and Johnny Price and Stu Barnett, Q1, Q2 tables,
Sure.
et cetera, so there might be some sort of interim, something we can do.
I had a question that Jeff Scott posed, but he had to zip out to a meeting, but
Okay.
on the, you guys already have the GIS layer up, which I forgot to mention to folks. But the buffers are on the GIS layer, which is fantastic.
Right.
He
Yes,
had
ma'am.
a question about whether or not erosion hazard zones would be shown, if that's even feasible. And then also, you know, for those areas that, what are the notes? That wouldn't qualify as critical water quality zone because maybe it was the roadway had gone
yeah.
over, I'm not spitting it out, but.
Yeah, right, sure, the,
Right,
Drainage pattern had been modified by.
thank you.
right.
When the drainage pattern had been modified and you could prove that it wasn't a critical water quality, I guess he had a site where, of course, it's showing on GIS that it certainly is a critical, but
Right.
it's not, what the process is, you know, if that was gonna be taken into consideration, or do you just have to prove that up when you submit your plans? Probably that.
Yeah.
In the past, it's been that you prove that up when you submit the plans. We tend to not go in and change the GIS case by case. And we usually caveat it with this is a planning level
Right,
tool.
sure.
You're gonna need to do, you know, it might not be 64 acres is range exactly that point.
So Aaron, that's just,
General.
to summarize, that's a very general rough planning tool. That's not to be taken literally, that's exact, you grab it and transfer it on your site.
Yeah.
Yes.
We need to verify it for each site.
And we're proud of that tool. It's gotten, we've refined it over time. It's gotten better and better. Actually, we're actually redoing it as we speak. I mean, there'll be a new set of stream center lines available. Probably it's going to take about a year to get the whole
It's
thing
certainly a
done.
good starting
It
point.
is.
But we have,
Tool,
right, the new DEMs came out in 2012, so we have really high level, you know, much higher resolution information and so forth. So the drainage area thresholds will probably even improve as a result. But all the time, we get folks like y'all that come in and say, hey, I've got this site, and then we're showing this pipe is coming this way, and taking this drainage out, or bringing this drainage in, and therefore the threshold's different. And we actually appreciate that and want you guys to let us know about that. So what we did on the map is we took anything subsurface, and we took that off, we took that out, so that you know, like, there's big parts of, I'm just thinking out loud, Tannehill Branch, they're up, you know, subsurface around Highland Mall, those don't get a critical zone buffer, because there's no creek above ground, and so forth. But we do, like Aaron was saying, we're trying to be conservative in the sense that we're not sure if it's a modified ditch or roadway kind of thing yet, so we just leave it on there for now unless it's in a pipe. We are, and so Jeff's other, was that?
Excuse me, what was the date? What's the most recent topography date? What was that last update?
Is it January 2012? I think it was January or February 2012. We have a flyover and we have the LiDAR now, and it's finally, we actually just released the, took the 2-foot topo too.
Okay, the buffers that are currently on the viewer are based on 2003.
But the buffers on the viewer are based on 2003, so our project this year is to try to get those up to speed. They're not going to be radical changes, but there'll be some change. There'll be some changes on that.
Okay. And same thing for aerial information? 2012. So the image is now based on 12 or 3?
I mean,
Yeah.
the image is available from 2012.
Is that what's currently on your GIS?
On the viewer, I think so.
That's new, I didn't realize it was 2012. I don't know if we have 2012 data yet.
The
Maybe we
viewer
do.
at least has 2009.
I think it's 2009.
Yeah, I think
I don't
it's-
know if they've got the
Right.
2012
Okay.
imagery up there yet.
Okay, well, it's,
Is the topo available in 2012 yet?
it is, and, I mean, what you could do is,
Well, it's available internally, I'm not sure.
That's what he was just saying.
we haven't released it yet.
I'm not sure if they've released it yet.
Okay. Topo, well, it's close. If they release it to us, it's gonna be probably close to you getting.
What do we need to do? I know you guys are.
In the past, when I was,
working on stuff. If we need that for a certain site, could we request that from
I think it was CTM, right?
the CTM?
So Ross Clark, maybe? There's a fellow named Ross Clark, who is a good contact for this.
Is there a phone number for him?
311.
Well, look it up. Okay, Ross Clark, okay, got it.
Yeah, I might have it in my phone, but,
McKee, you had, I'm sorry.
yeah, well, I was gonna ask, somebody asked, you asked about the erosion hazard zone?
Right,
We're not gonna map the actual erosion hazard zone, but it's gonna be a little bit like the Barton Springs zone, Edwards Aquifer deal. Remember how there's a 1,500-foot buffer around the recharge zone, and so if you're in that buffer around it, then you have to double check and make sure that verify whether or not there is karst and blah, blah, blah. We're gonna do the same thing, we already have done the same thing with the erosion hazard zones. We took the creek center lines and we put a 100-foot buffer on all the creek center lines except the ones that are subsurface again. And so we're working to try to get that up onto our website also. And that just means if you're within that buffer, you need to check. It doesn't mean there is one, and it doesn't say how wide it is, it just means you need to look at that. Because the new ordinance says if you're within 100 feet of a waterway, a classified waterway or 64 acre or greater creek, you need to look at the erosion hazard zone and see if you're, get a problem.
Will that be a requirement for submittal? Or prior permit? Defining the road hazard zone?
I don't know where,
It seems
I
like
think it's pretty
that's-
similar to whatever you do for a floodplain, I don't know.
Okay,
And
so we'll need to anticipate going in before we submit.
probably
Not
some,
to just study the lot. You have to do, well, you have to normally do an environmental assessment. So it's got to be studied. Yeah.
That's a good question.
Yeah. I don't understand that.
And is that criteria in place yet?
Take a moment.
It is, it's in the DCM.
You're talking about whether or not
Appendix F.
the erosion hazard zone study needs to be completed prior to completeness or throughout the process?
That's,
Yeah, that was kind of what, it sounds, I mean, floodplain, it depends on what you're doing with the floodplain. You would show the defined floodplain normally after completeness to an extent, but you might still be doing studies during the process. So the erosion hazard zone, if you have to do that full study at completeness, like an environmental assessment, that's a good chunk of time in advance of the process versus doing a defined drainage study that you might do during the process.
I think we may have to, I mean, just a suggestion
Process.
is that we may need to communicate with you guys prior to bringing something in like that, just to see if it's real, to bring that in with submittal or something we need to address during the review process, because some of those things may be so, somewhat subjective and need to meet with you guys out in the field and have all the other information before we can really
We can definitely
go
check
through everything.
with Andy and,
Yeah.
Morgan Byers and others to make sure whether they were anticipating it being a completeness check or not.
That'd be helpful to
That's
understand.
kind of more in
Yeah.
the PDRD
Yeah.
realm than ours.
And perhaps that conversation in the interim until all those things are determined, I think maybe just some communication to the intake staff that's actually accepting applications to ensure they're not kicking anybody out for these items that are still in the gray area, so that we're all still able to start application processes until that's determined. That would be
That's where we
helpful.
typically get hung up, is if it's a hard and fast written item on the checklist, if we don't have it, we're out.
It's just an automatic.
Yeah, exactly. Right, so if the checklist isn't up to date, then another issue. Okay.
Can you speak to the definition of the waterway, at least as, from what our reviewers, when we submit a site plan, look at, example would be, if we're looking at a property that's next to TxDOT road, they recently did improvements to the road and piped the channel that does drain over 64 acres.
Okay.
From quite a distance, and even after the head wall and it opens back up, they still created a new channel basically for that area. So it's kind of a, where does it start? Even though we're way over, the 64 acres already, like you said, it's pipe, it's not. You're not gonna have buckets on pipe, of course.
And so the pipe part would not, Aaron, right, the pipe part's not gonna have a critical force, and then I think you'd be interacting with our environmental review staff on that, on the, does it qualify as natural or not? If it's, it is gonna be case-by-case basis on those,
I don't know if there's any discussion yet on, if it was something that was put in place more than 5 years ago or 10 years ago, or, if there's some kind of timeline discussion on it, when that channel was created. If you prove it's a man-made channel, is there a timeline discussion on that end, or?
Right, and it just being man-made doesn't necessarily, you could straighten a channel, but then still leave the natural integrity and so forth, or have it grow back, and, hopefully that's the norm, as opposed to just, something completely artificial and forever. But some of them, like along SH-130 or something, it's just Burnick Road. We have creeks that run, creeks that are ditches that run along Burnick Road that are, we're not gonna call that a waterway that needs a critical, because it's just a bar ditch basically, but they're big enough.
So I
But
guess even the maintenance of that channel would come into play at that point. If it's something that's been there for 30 years, if they mowed it every week or month
Right,
during that 30 years, and it still looks like it was just done.
sure. And then I think our staff's gonna look at function and what's,
Is there any way to get a preliminary read on that kind of stuff, just from our due diligence? Site plan, layout stuff? Who do we want to meet with on that?
the guys are gonna be, it's gonna be Morgan Byers and, I'm not Morgan, I meant.
Andrew Clayman, Scott Hires, the
Yeah.
folks in ERM that would be doing, critical
Actual
environmental feature
reviews? Okay.
review.
Let me ask them when, so you're wanting to do something, just kind of like, look, I want to just frame in whether or not, what is this?
My example again is, we're doing a site next to the Textile Railway. They did improvements very recently. They piped the existing channel, let's just say, well within our property, and it opens up within our property, but they continue to do channel improvements till it got closer to the actual, let's just call it a creek or tributary.
Right,
So we wanted to do site plan layout experiments, for the developer, to see if this is gonna be a possible site or not with this channel down the middle of it. So, just from a site plan layout standpoint.
okay, and I don't know what,
We're not gonna be sitting in anything for 6 months or whatever down the road.
well, let me ask our guys, the several folks that are going to be doing this, and maybe additional staff, of course, to help with that, but at what point can they come in and help out with that? Do you have to actually submit something, or is that part of the question? Or can you get something up front that's a little more preliminary? That's when you need it, really.
Okay, we're just trying to get an idea of what direction we should
Yeah,
go.
what kind of impacts are we looking at? Basically.
Okay, great, okay, I'll ask that question. Cool. More action.
So are we the first opportunity outside of meetings with the city? Have you had other group discussions like this yet, or gotten any feedback?
We've gotten a number of phone calls,
Okay.
individual small questions,
Yeah.
but we haven't had any big group discussions today. This is really helpful actually for us, because
Well, it's
We're finding out
really
stuff.
helpful for us. We appreciate you guys coming out and doing it.
we're gonna have a punch list of things that we're gonna go, okay, well, these are things that are delaying you guys or, making it, more awkward or confusing or whatever, or just need something, clarification. Yes?
Could you just clarify, I guess the detention ponds, wet basins are allowed in the critical water quality zone as long as you comply with the floodplain modification? Does that mean if we don't put it in the floodplain, but it's in the critical, is that what you're talking about, or?
Let's see. It's, here, let me break it out to make sure I'm not.
The floodplain modification guidelines speak more to if you're doing an in-channel detention or wet pond. Then there's some additional modeling that needs to be done to make sure
That's
there's
what
not
that
a
one is
sediment
really-
transport issue.
It's more inline detention.
Inline
Not necessarily- If we had the outlet, whatever, going into the critical, but not into the floodplain, is that in case that?
So with the tributary that feeds your wet pond, is it 64 acres or greater, or is it smaller than 64?
Well, I'm just
Dave, you're
curious
looking
how
at
that's being, it's saying that it's allowed if you comply with the floodplain modification. Is that only really considering inline detention basins, wet basins?
Yeah, wet basins are almost always in line. There may be a
Because
few.
otherwise it starts
Well,
affecting your
not-
hydraulics.
I think what he's saying is, what if you're just doing a water quality pond for private development? Could you put that within your critical water quality zone for that regulation that he just read? Whether, if it's a wet pond for private development water quality treatment only, not in line, it's just accepting site
Well, I
stormwater.
mean, yeah.
Could you put it in your critical, is that what you're asking? Yeah.
Yeah, basically, it's allowed in there as long as you comply with the floodplain modification, but if I'm not putting it in line in the floodplain, then it still is, that's when it's allowed in the critical.
Okay, let me, Aaron, if you know it faster than I am, I'm going back to looking at the.
I think that's the case. Yeah, the floodplain modification guidelines are really more concerned with putting it in channel and sediment transport issues.
Right.
There's some new continuous simulation.
So am I gonna trigger on the mitigation requirements as soon as that sticks upon in the critical area?
Not if you're outside that.
I think you would if you're, yeah, it depends, so then those have to do with how far, are you in the critical versus just
So
the
if my pond's
floodplain
an
versus-
acre and I'm, encroaching into the critical water quality zone, is that mitigation?
Your pond is a use that's allowed in the critical zone under 261, so it doesn't have to
So
go
that
through the
trigger off
restoration and
mitigation.
mitigation tables.
Okay, thank you for that.
It just needs to show that it's compliant with sediment transport issues.
So the only way to put a pond in the critical water quality zone is if the 100-year floodplain is narrower than the critical.
Yes.
That's the only way.
Or unless you go through this added step of floodplain criteria. Yeah.
Well, you can put it in line if you do some continuous simulation modeling to show that you're not gonna cause a sediment transport issue on the stream.
Those are main worry with this.
So that's for a detention or wet pond. You can also put green water quality controls in the outer half of the critical water quality zone, outside of the floodplain and erosion hazard zones.
So
things like
biofilter,
biofiltration,
rain garden,
Rain garden.
vegetative filter strip. But on the back of the wet pond, so Aaron, what you're saying is it's an allowed, if you do these things, if you do the sediment transport model, make sure that there's not problems with flow coming through this thing, then it is an allowed use and therefore you don't have to go through the functional assessment deal, is that? So you don't actually, so you, and I don't think that has to do with whether you're under your floodplain or critical or whatever. It's allowed in the critical, therefore, under these circumstances, it's allowed. So we're,
Put a pond in the critical water quality zone, as you're saying, but it happens to be also inside the floodplain, but we can't touch the floodplain, because we're putting berms and stuff now in the floodplain, which you couldn't do. So it's kind of like contradicting.
I think the intent is that you're putting a pond in the critical outside the floodplain.
Outside the
It's
floodplain.
just giving you that additional area for your pond.
the floodplain
The only
modification
time you
allows-
put it in the floodplain would
it's
be
allowed in
if
the
it's like an
critical.
inline
Yeah,
detention
right.
facility for a regional, not water quality for your site, because then you
Otherwise, that would impact your flood.
yeah, they still want you to impact the floodplain. They're just giving you that added area to put your water
Or,
quality pond in.
you could have a wet pond on a 64-acre stream for a larger site that would be in line.
And the-
And again, that would be doing this sediment transport analysis, but not the restoration and mitigation required by floodplain modification.
Can you talk briefly about that sedimentation process you're describing?
Yes, I can read it, because it was written by Morgan Myers.
Okay.
So he would be the best person to ask about if you have further questions on it.
Okay.
But in-channel basins should not adversely impact channel stability by creating additional erosion or sedimentation downstream of the structure. In alluvial channels, the basin shall not capture excess bed material loads such that a hungry water effect results in additional erosion downstream. For channels with limited bed material load, the basin shall not extend the duration of erosive flows above the channel boundary material threshold and cause additional downstream erosion. Downstream impacts of in-channel impoundment shall be evaluated using a continuous simulation routing model that computes cumulative excess stream power or sediment transport.
Is that clear now? Okay, so we've got enough to do on that.
I think there was also a question before you all got here on buffer averaging.
Okay.
And if we were to pursue that, and say we put it on our preliminary plan or a plat, and then at site plan, we decide, there may be a better way to do it, or we want to shift it a little, is the process such that we'd have to go in and amend either prelim or the final plat before we could maybe make those modifications at site plan? I don't know that you guys will know that answer necessarily.
Kind of
Or is
secondary
there a
part
way-
of that was, is there an option at the time of prelim or plating to defer some of that to the time of site plan, given, especially for commercial site, not necessarily a large master plan, but for commercial development, if a subdivision plat was being done in advance of a site plan, to defer that, so that you can actually do that averaging specific to what the use of the site is gonna be.
Yeah, it sounds a lot like
Sounds like a good question for Gary.
Because otherwise, now you're affecting on subdivision-related issues, and you move this thing slightly, now I've got to replat the
Well, and
property.
I don't think we wanna inundate.
Well, you've actually got to, not replat, you've got to vacate the plat and replat it to move that.
When vacating the plat would only be an option necessarily if it was a single lot. If you had a multi-lot plat with lots already developed, I don't think vacating a plat is an option, so therefore you've eliminated that. I've got a case with 2 developed tracts, 1 undeveloped tract that we would potentially want to modify the floodplain, or the critical setbacks. And I can't vacate that plat in order to do that today because I've got development on the other 2 parcels.
Now, we might be able to do a re-subdivision or amended plat to move,
The
you're
setbacks,
moving a line, you're not removing the restriction, you're amending.
adjusting it.
Well, but amended plats speak only to lot lines, not
Yeah, so, that just may be
water
something.
quality zones.
I think a deference would be the best option for everybody to eliminate doing things twice, but I don't know if that's an option.
All right, that's the total annual sizing question.
You got your Andy list?
Yeah, we got a long lengthy list. We met with the environmental reviewers right before this, and we made yet another, we have a list. That's a good question. Yeah. We've had that before where we're, there's a new subdivision impervious cover section, or commercial impervious cover section, where you basically have to track your impervious cover through you plat it out, and then you start getting these things, these site plans coming in with commercial development. You need to make sure that the whole area's impervious cover doesn't exceed your limit. You can't just kind of do it on a case-by-case basis and with these site plans and oops, sorry, we just busted our impervious cover limit. You got to, track it, kind of like you would with a master plan development. So anyway, it sounds like this is kind of similar on the buffer. I'm not sure how we would do that. It sounds like you're locking in your buffer earlier on.
Right, and then
It's a
something
similar question to the, what if you already have a water quality transition zone line in your plat? Is there a way without vacating that you can
Right.
change a critical zone line or remove a water quality transition zone line? If you're doing something to comply with current code.
But in those, I'm sorry.
If you try to just use a subdivision for the intended use, which is subdivision-related items, and then address floodplain easements and other restrictions, I think where it starts getting cloudy is when you start throwing things like critical water quality zones on there. Okay, you can beg the question, do I stick capital corner lines on there? I mean, where do you stop?
Right.
And should we, is this now a good time now to step back and maybe less might be more in that respect, is let's maybe put drainage easements on there and defer critical water quality zones, all those things to site plan. For both our benefits, especially for commercial. I just think we get more tangled up every time we add more stuff in the subdivision process. It's just harder for both of us to do anything.
We're just gonna be able to track it like the impervious cover where you end up, oh, okay, we're gonna buffer average and have the minimum, and the minimum, and the minimum, and then at the very end, you're like, oops, we don't have enough room to put the rest of the thing.
Because I can see the buffer averaging being very site specific,
Yes.
and,
It would be straightforward. Could you do it where you plat it on there and you show where it
there may
is?
be some that are very obvious, that you just plat, my sense is that it goes, it's gonna be very site specific. Maybe once we go through this first year and see a few more examples, then we might have a different view on that, but initially,
And that's not, I don't think,
that's our thought.
you guys aren't necessarily saying like you have 4 lots and this one wants to come in and go and push their extra buffer onto the next lot, and then, I think it's just that this lot's in subdivision and they don't wanna show their buffer because they might wanna come back and change it when they're in site plan.
Right, I think
On
it's
that
more,
lot.
On that
exactly,
lot.
I think it's more specific, right, lot to lot. If you don't already have a developer propose, or even the developer isn't sure the configuration of the site plan for that site, that may change how you buffer the site, how you do those buffers.
Right.
I don't know that it's to push it down the road. I think if you're wanting to average it over multiple lots, then you almost have to require it at plat. But if you're just talking about
Yeah,
specific to
single
a lot, average on your lot only, then, deferring it to site plan would, I think, save us all a lot of time and headache on the backside of having to redo all those plats.
Yeah, I don't think it hurts you at all to put all that stuff on the preliminary plan, for example. But as soon as you subdivide that
And record
portion
it.
of it, record it now and locked in. So then you're kind of going against the grain a little bit, if you will, because you're showing a water quality, you're showing all these different lines outside the floodplain that are on there. And now I'm gonna plat it, but not put that on the final plat. Where do I catch that?
Yeah.
Now somebody's got to catch it on the site plan.
So the main thing is you're showing a polygon of a certain area where the line actually goes is not a big deal as long as the area is at least as big as the thing.
Yeah.
I just
So I
foresee
don't-
PDR having a hard time enforcing that at site plan if you have a plat that shows it. I
Right.
mean, it's just like if you have a plat that shows any other line that's, I've had that scenario where it's changed or something's been proven up and PDR has a hard time enforcing it at site plan if it shows up on the plat. They'll fall back on that, or ask you to modify it. So I just, if we end up modifying 50% of our plats because of this, because we're going through a process, that's just a lot of added work for everybody that seems unnecessary.
So
If we
see
can't
that-
just put a note, even a note on the plat that says,
Must
the
comply.
critical water quality zones must be delineated and equal X number of acres at the time of site plan, and that way it's not just totally omitted, but it's covered in a way that gives you that flexibility. Because you could total up what that land area might be at that time.
I mean,
Right.
it's like putting
That's what-
building setback lines on a plat and then saying you're not gonna honor it. You're gonna get tripped up every time you go do a title survey.
Well,
Even if
it'll make
you got
developers
document that
nervous.
somebody says, okay, well, you can deviate and give an exception to the building line. You get tripped up every single time you do a title survey on property where you got a building encroaching into a building setback line, even if you've got a waiver grant. You almost have to go get that recorded to make it hold up and support that subdivision process. So, again, you're going back into and having to address more subdivision-related questions and legal
Yeah.
issues, and it'll make Steve a lot busier.
That was a great question, and you're right, you're nailing what we want to do. We want to get that right polygon size and so forth, and you're like, that note you talked about captures what we were hoping for. I'm not sure how the process works. We'll find that out.
And it's still very early in the process. I mean, what I anticipate what we were talking about earlier is that we're gonna have to obviously communicate all this information to our clients and try to advise them how we should approach projects differently. Everyone's gonna be a little different approach. On some sites, it may make sense to try to time our final plat closer to our site plan process. You know, that portion of the site that we feel comfortable we can nail down, and maybe move forward with that. Otherwise, until that point, don't go any further than a preliminary plan if there's too many unknowns with the rest of the tract. You know, if you're close enough to be able to final plat it, then you probably are close, especially on the commercial property, you're probably fairly close to knowing what your site's gonna look like, or should be.
Right.
And that's the main reason you wanna do it. You can run those parallel, those processes parallel. So, it'll be an education process for both of those, just to see how it works and how it does.
Yes,
More fun to come with.
exactly.
Have you had some projects submitted under it? I'm just curious, going back to kind of some of those intake type questions and how they've been accepting them, or have there been any submitted? Maybe not, it's only been a few weeks.
Yeah, it's only been a few weeks. I mean, it takes, you know, you usually gotta know it takes a while to put together the packet, so.
Sure,
Yeah, I think there's
guess-
been some people in DAC kind of doing sort of a preliminary development assessment
right,
kind of thing, but not, it hasn't been complete, just check that out.
Right.
because that'll be an interesting test about what they.
Well, I'm guessing at completeness, it probably hasn't been caught if, on the
Yeah.
development side, the engineer probably did Q and Q2 anyways, and then all the other additional items aren't on the checklist.
It'll get hit
So it's
at
probably
review.
not gonna be caught until somebody tries to go in
Get
and
the
not
review
submit something
process.
that's been taken
Right.
off, or until we get comments.
Yeah,
It'll come up if we try to
Sure.
not put something in there that we now don't have to, like Q and Q2, even though that's on the checklist. That'll be where we see it.
We'll definitely make that Q1, Q2 completeness checklist thing a high priority.
And in the desired development zone, can you verify if a slope amp's required or not? Or is that still gonna be a requirement?
Okay, I'll ask.
I would think it would be,
Yeah.
because you're still gonna need to comply with construction estimates.
I mean, if you have a site that's obvious and there's nothing above 0 to 15 or anything above 0 to 15 in your critical, your floodplain area, could you not ask for a waiver of that requirement based on the fact that you don't have any slopes over 15%?
or maybe the checklist even states that if it's not applicable, if you don't have slopes over 15%, that you're not required to submit it, so you don't automatically get kicked out when you don't have your
I
slope.
think we've tried that before, there's an no trust issue there, it's like submit it to show it doesn't exist.
Prove it.
I mean, I think I've tried that argument, and it doesn't work.
Well, maybe if they're changing the checklist, this would be our chance to get in there.
Or shot.
I don't know,
Well,
seems reasonable.
it would seem that you'd only need a slope map in the areas you're gonna construct on. Because if it's in the floodplain, I've got my
Right.
topo map there, who cares about doing a slope map in that area? What are we gonna benefit from that, really? We've done it, we can see the topography there. I don't know that a slope map's gonna tell us valuable information if we're not building anything on it. So
Right, gotcha.
why even go through that process?
How fine grained is your slope map? What do you guys usually submit? What is the process you use to?
Most of our slope maps are based on 2-foot or 1-foot contours, and when we do a site topo, it's 1 foot. You know, short of that, if we're using city topo for something very early in the process, it's gonna be about a 2-foot city topo map.
So that's acceptable.
Unless
That's
there's
an
less than that
acceptable.
available out in the day.
We have,
I know by ordinance, you're allowed to use, what is it, 4, 5 foot?
is that right? So, we actually, I had our group send out a very large GIS file, but it's a topo, it's using our 2003 data at this point, and it shows slopes, and I mean, if you had a site that had nothing.
Because you go back, you know, and you do a topo map on a 1-foot contour, and you get some weird spike in a slope area, and you're looking at, somebody dumped some hollow fill right there.
Right.
You go back and average your 4-foot contours, and it disappears. You don't really have a 25% slope there. You got a, trailer load of fill, somebody dumped right there.
Right.
You don't have a slope issue. putting out there to move a flat field. So,
Right,
really?
right.
I can't put them
All right,
on the spot.
Let me ask about
I
that.
think that was put in there for that reason, is to help you get rid of those little inconsistent areas like that.
Okay.
Now, before you leave too, can you, I just want to make sure I got this right. If we have questions on buffering at the preliminary stage and also on the erosion hazard zone, do both of those questions go to the ERM group, or is there somebody different to talk about critical water quality zone buffering that we should discuss stuff with?
I think both of those actually go to PDR.
Both go to
Yeah,
PDR,
initially, so.
So
let's see,
Andy and
yeah.
Ronnie,
Yeah, so actually, and so Sue Barnett's group with the EV review is gonna have the buffer averaging.
okay,
And then the erosion hazard zone, I think they're actually hiring a new person that's kind of in the works now, but there's gonna be somebody, I've got Ron Chakowski, I think, is gonna be helping, is that right? With is the point person, and they may have one extra person as well. We'll be helping in the engineering review group with Johnny Price. We'll be answering the erosion hazard zone questions. And then they may kick it up and talk to us about some of that other stuff too, if there's really wacky stuff.
I just wanted to make sure we had a contact to reach out to on those items, because I anticipate a lot of this will have some preliminary questions
Yeah,
for
and
the work we're doing.
The HC one's a big deal because it's the one thing that affects residential construction. You get a single family home within 100 feet of the creek, you gotta do an erosion hazard zone assessment. There's a real easy peasy version that we've put out there that you can do, as a homeowner could probably even do, maybe, hopefully, we'll check it. But, and then there's a more sophisticated one which would need more people like you guys. But anyway, that's gonna be a big.
So you're telling me Ron's gonna be really busy.
Ron's being a busy guy, that's why we're trying to hire another person.
So one thing that you guys might want to think about, and get back with us on, is we're going to be working on a series of online video modules, kind of guided PowerPoints with a script that walk people through different parts of the ordinance. And so we're going through right now trying to prioritize what to do first. We're starting with the erosion hazard zone as the first one we'll be doing. But if you guys have some other things that you think would be good to go in that next sequence, like buffer averaging or development of critical zone or floodplain modification, then just let us know which ones you think would be high priority for getting public training out.
We've got to do them eventually, and we want us to start with one versus another, pitch in your ideas, and we'll definitely put that in the mix.
The functional assessment part is one, I think, it's gonna be new to everybody and definitely take some time to get everybody acclimated to that.
And we, in January, are going to be doing one of those capital area erosion lunchtime presentations in the center, just on the functional assessment, and so we'll have.
January 10th, it's a Friday, that's right.
That'd be good to know.
And we did talk about having some kind of video thing for that too, right?
Yeah, so we,
Not necessarily for that
that's kind of
day,
the first step on that, and the next step would either be in the field training with our.
This was helpful, but going out with you guys like we did and really
Right.
see a couple of different examples was very valuable.
I'm very visual.
So, yeah,
You
well,
can
our
do this,
ultimate,
but-
our kind of dream, if we can get our Channel 6 staff is very busy and it's sometimes hard to get access to, but is have them go out in the field with our biologists and stream restoration staff and just have them walk through each one of the steps
I think
and
that
make a
would be
video and put it online.
Very helpful.
I also think any of those videos touching on how it works through the process, like I know I've asked a lot of process-related questions, but most people that are using the code on this stuff are specifically going to need to understand how that affects their processing. What's the more upfront lead time? Who do I have to talk to? Which department do I negotiate this through and when?
Right.
Knowing that kind of stuff is going to be really helpful and will save you guys probably from asking those questions or answering those questions multiple times, at least for the development community, for developers and engineers to know.
Good
Yeah, but just that process in itself.
Stephanie, let's jump in here and try and ask.
No,
On section 25.8.261, subitem D, it says utility line including storm drain is prohibited in critical zone. If I'm building a pond adjacent to the critical zone and I want to discharge into that channel as low as possible, is this prohibiting me from having that discharge pipe go down into the critical zone?
I'm sorry, you want to, You wanted to build what is the feature you're trying to build?
I've got a pond that I'm building,
A stormwater pond?
a stormwater pond, and I want to be able to discharge that at the lowest possible elevation on my site, which is going to be inside the critical zone. I'll do the erosion hazard protection that's necessary, but is this section saying that I cannot put a storm pipe inside that critical zone?
I think our guys, we asked the same question ourselves because we weren't sure of the answer. You know, they said no. I mean,
You can do that.
that you, no, it's not.
It's not prohibited.
It's not prohibited.
We actually went through and clarified that because there was some confusion on the language in the past that it just spoke about crossing, and so people are saying, well, what if I just want to go into to do a discharge or to connect to a wastewater line that's already there?
Yeah, I mean,
And so we clarified that you can go into or through. So that would be going into.
So, right, so your sand filter outfall could come into the critical there.
Okay.
Hopefully you could have it up slope of that. And we're actually allowing you to put green water quality in the upper half of the critical. Meaning, but then they clarified that yes, you could have the under drain from, so that'd be a biofilter, it wouldn't be a sand filter, but the biofilter could daylight down slope of that in the lower part of the critical.
Okay, thanks.
Can you transfer buffer averaging between an intermediate waterway and a minor waterway on the same site?
Yes, yes. In fact, we're actually encouraging people to potentially, as one option we show, how you can squeeze down your buffer and then move it past 64. If you can go up toward 32 like you guys did at Whisper Valley. I mean, so if you want to, we're just looking for creek protection, and if you want to increase it over there, so yeah, we don't care if it's a major, intermediate, minor.
So yeah, you have to meet you still have to comply with the minimums on all the different classifications, but you would just show, kind of like we were talking about earlier, here's the amount of acreage of critical zone that I have on this site, and demonstrate that you still have that same acreage protected, just the geometry
it's
is
the same, I just changed
shifting.
where it fits, okay.
So there's no maximum though? You can extend out as far as you want in areas?
Yeah, if you would like to exceed the acreage that's required, we would love that,
Well,
but it's not.
Well, I could see a wacky situation where you, like, everything's super thin down, and then you kind of come out with this one giant, you know,
Oh, you
wacky
mean
buffer.
like a maximum,
For the averaging.
You still gotta meet the minimums.
You gotta meet the
Right,
yeah.
you'll have your minimums, but if you have an area, like you said, that then juts out really far
Right.
to get your area, is that allowed?
Up to 1/2 of the overall amount, don't you have the
Yeah, I know, criteria.
at some point, you're kind of losing that nexus with the,
Critical zone.
with
I
the
mean,
riparian
with the creek.
area.
You gotta,
yeah,
It's gotta be-
so
yeah,
it's
we don't
like
wanna-
a 50%
we don't see one
like
that's, you
mass
know.
requirement, yeah.
I mean, that's a super creative way of looking at it, but it's not, yeah. Is that in the criteria? Are we,
I'll go back.
It looks like it's in the criteria manual and 25-892. Allowed to reduce by up to 1/2 if the overall amount of area protected remains the same.
but, yeah, so we're worried about, I guess we're
So
worried
you still have
about,
to keep.
are you slimming it way down to the minimum for 90% of it and then just have some, you know, like flag lot looking thing come
Yeah.
along? Which is not really a
That's not the
buffer.
intent.
Yeah, I think if you go back to the intent of that we heard a lot about during the discussions about that particular issue during stakeholder meetings, I think you get too far out of the intended boundary of that, you're gonna get squashed on that approach, so I would just caution, let's do it where it makes sense, and it's defendable, and not something that's.
And if you went up and buffered in some heritage trees or did something that was a little bit further even still, I mean, you could probably make a case for that. Like, look, here's some environmental features I'm trying to protect,
Sure.
et cetera. You know, it's not, you just don't want it to look super gerrymandered, you know, or whatever, so. Anyway, that's something I look at, but,
Yeah.
sure.
Anything else, folks?
These are great questions, guys. Exactly why we appreciate being here.
Just real quick, going back to like that slope map kind of issue and when it's necessary to show. Did we clarify on like erosion hazard? That is for sure just when you're proposing construction within 100 feet or 50 or whatever, depending on your intermediate or minor.
Erosion hazard zone's always, 100 is the, just where.
Okay,
yeah,
sorry,
where
I
it is,
couldn't
yeah.
remember, but as far as showing that, we only need to show that on our plans if we're proposing construction within that.
I think so, yeah, I would think so.
That's what.
And as far as like a checklist item, again, like if that's something that's gonna be on, completeness, did you show your erosion hazards in the wall? Even
And that's a pretty straightforward, you can put a 100-foot buffer and you can put EHZ on it and just,
if we're not doing anything with it, okay.
then you just show nothing's going on. So it wouldn't be an onerous deal
But
there.
it would be good to know, it's a good point, just do we need to show it or do we not? Because we don't want to get kicked out if it is easy to show that.
Like you said, yeah, if you're outside of it, and it's just 100 dropping in there, then great, but yeah.
Okay.
Thank you guys, as always, and we'll continue to
Thank
see
you
you in
guys.
phase
Yeah,
2
questions?
and rules and.
Welcome.
We'll be in touch.
We'll come back and we'll email you back some questions, answers.
That'd be great.
If we have some more questions, we should email anyone, if you guys are sending directly to you, we'll send it or.
You can send them to me and I can send them on, that might be easier so
So
they're not
we don't
getting
send you,
clouded.
in case you get 20 emails from
Yeah.